Hello everyone, we're going to continue reading Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lat 49, this time Chapter 4. Though she saw Mike Fallopian again and did trace the text of the courier's tragedy a certain distance, these follow-ups were no more disquieting than other revelations which now seemed to come crowding in exponentially, as if the more she collected the more would come to her, until everything she saw, smelled, dreamed, remembered would somehow come to be woven into the Trastero. For one thing, she read over the will more closely. If it was really Pierce's attempt to leave an organized something behind after his own annihilation, then it was part of her duty, wasn't it, to bestow life on what had persisted, to try to be what Driblet was, the dark machine in the center of the planetarium, to bring the estate into pulsing stelliferous meaning, all in a soaring dome around her. If only so much didn't stand in her way. Her deep ignorance of law, of investment, of real estate, ultimately of the dead man himself. The bond the probate court had her post was perhaps their evaluation in dollars of how much did stand in her way. Under the symbol she copied off the latrine wall of the scope into her memo book, she wrote, "Shall I project a world?" If not project, then at least flash some arrow in the dome to skitter across constellations and trace out your dragon, whale, Southern Cross. Anything might help. It was some such feeling that got her up early one morning to go to a Yoyodyne stockholders meeting. There was nothing she could do at it, yet she felt it might redeem her a little from her inertia. It gave her a round white visitor's badge at one of the gates, and she parked in an enormous lot next to a Quonset building, painted pink and about 100 yards long. This was the Yoyodyne cafeteria and scene of her meeting. For 2 hours, Oedipus sat on a long bench between old men who might have been twins, and whose hands alternately, as if their owners were asleep and the mold-freckled hands out roaming dream landscapes had falling onto her thighs. Around them all, Negroes carried gunboats of mashed potatoes, spinach, shrimp, zucchini, pot roasts to the long, glittering steam tables, preparing to feed a moontide invasion of Yoyodyne workers. The routine business took an hour. For another hour, the shareholders and proxies and company officers held a Yoyodyne songfest. To the tune of Cornell's alma mater, they sang, "High above the L.A. freeways and the traffic's whine stands the well-known Galactronics branch of Yoyodyne. To the end we swear undying loyalty to you, pink pavilions bravely shining, palm trees tall and true." Being held by this as the president of the company, Mr. Clayton Bloody Chicklets himself, and to the tune of Ara Lee, "Bendix guides the warheads in, Avco builds them nice, Douglas, North American, Grumman gets their slice. Martin launches off a pad, Lockheed from a sub, we can't get the R&D on a Piper Club. Convair boasts the satellite, and to orbits round, Boeing builds the Minutemen, we stay on the ground. Yoyodyne, contracts flee thee that. DOD has shafted thee, out of spite, I'll bet." And dozens of other old favorites whose lyrics she couldn't remember. The singers were then formed into platoon-sized groups for a quick tour of the plant. Somehow, Oedipus got lost. 1 minute she was gazing at a mock-up of a space capsule safely surrounded by old, solemn men. The next, alone in the great fluorescent murmur of office activity. As far as she could see in any direction, it was white or pastel. Men's shirts, papers, drawing boards, all she could think of was to put her shades off for this light and wait for somebody to rescue her, but nobody noticed. She began to wander aisles among light blue desks, turning a corner now and then. Heads came up to the sound of her heels. Engineers stared until she'd passed, but nobody spoke to her. 5 or 10 minutes went by this way, and panic growing inside her head. There seemed to be no way out of the area. Then, by accident, Dr. Hilarious, if asked, would accuse her of using subliminal cues in the environment to guide her to a particular person, or, howsoever, she came on one Stanley Kotex, who wore wire-rimmed bifocals, sandals, argyle socks, and at first glance seemed too young to be working here. As it turned out, he wasn't working, only doodling with the fat felt pencil this sign, the one that was in the stall earlier. "Hello there," Oedipus said, arrested by his coincidence. And on whim, he added, "Kirby sent me." This having been the name on the latrine wall. It was supposed to sound conspiratorial, but it came out silly. "Hi," said Stanley Kotex, deftly sliding the big envelope he'd been doodling on for an open door, and then he closed, catching on the side of her badge. "You're lost, huh?" She knew blunt questions like, "What does that symbol mean?" would get her nowhere. She said, "I'm a tourist, actually, a stockholder." Stockholder? He gave her once over, hooked her with his foot in a swivel chair from the next desk, and rolled it over for her. "Sit down. Can you really influence policy or make suggestions they won't file in the garbage?" "Yes," lied Oedipa, to see where it would take them. "See," Kotex said, "if you can get them to drop their claws on patients, that lady is my axe to grind. On patents, I should say." "Patents," Oedipa said. Kotex explained how every engineer, in signing the Yoyodyne contract, also signed away the patent rights to any inventions he might come up with. "This stifles your really creative engineer," Kotex said, adding bitterly, "wherever he may be." "I didn't think people invented anymore," said Oedipa, sensing this would goad him. "I mean, who's there been, really, since Thomas Edison? Isn't it all teamwork now?" Bloody Chicklets, in his welcoming speech this morning, had stressed teamwork. "Teamwork," Kotex snarled, "is one word for it, yeah. What it really is a way to avoid responsibility. It's a symptom of the gutlessness of the whole society." "Goodness," said Oedipa, "are you allowed to talk like that?" Kotex looked to both sides, then rolled his chair closer. "You know the Nephestus machine?" Oedipa only widened her eyes. "Well, this was invented by John Nephastus, who's up at Berkeley now. John's somebody who still invents things. Here, I have a copy of the patent." From a drawer, he produced a Xeroxed wad of papers, showing a box with a sketch of bearded Victorian on its outside, and coming out on the top, two pistons attached to a crankshaft and a flywheel. "Who's that with a beard?" asked Oedipa. "James Clerk Maxwell," explained Kotex, "a famous Scotch scientist who'd once postulated a tiny intelligence known as Maxwell's demon. The demon could sit in a box among air particles that were moving at all different random speeds, and sort out the fast molecules from the slow ones. Fast molecules have more energy than slow ones. Concentrate enough of them in one place, and you have a region of high temperature. You can then use the difference in temperature between this hot region of the box and any cooler region to drive a heat engine. Since the demon only sat and sorted, you wouldn't have to put any real work into the system. So you would be violating the second law of thermodynamics, getting something for nothing, causing perpetual motion." "Sorting isn't work," Oedipa said. Tell them down at the post office you'll find yourself in a mailbag headed for Fairbanks, Alaska, without even a fragile sticker going for you." "It's mental work," Kotex said, "but not work in the thermodynamic sense." He went on to tell about how the Nephastus machine contained an honest-to-God Maxwell's demon. All you had to do was stare at the photo of Clerk Maxwell, concentrate on which cylinder, left or right, you wanted the demon to raise the temperature in. The air would expand and push a piston. The familiar Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge photo, showing Maxwell on the right profile, seemed to work best. Oedipa, behind her shades, looked around carefully, trying not to move her head. Nobody paid any attention to them. The air conditioning hummed on. IBM typewriters chiggered away. Swivel chairs squeaked. Fat reference manuals were slammed shut. Rattling blueprints folded and refolded, while high overhead the long, silent fluorescent bulbs glared merrily. All with Yoyodyne was normal, except right here, where Oedipa Moss, with 1,000 other people to choose from, had to walk uncoerced into the presence of madness. Not everybody can work it, of course. Kotex, having warmed to his subject, was telling her, "Only people with a gift. Sensitives, John calls them." Oedipa rested her shades on her nose and batted her eyelashes, figuring to coquette her way off this conversational hook. "Would I make a good sensitive, you think?" "You really want to try?" He could write to him. He only knows a few sensitives. He'd let you try. Oedipa took out her little memo book and opened to the symbol he'd copied, and the words, "Shall I project a world? Box 573, said Kotex. "In Berkeley?" "No." His voice had gone funny, and she looked up, too sharply, by which time, carried by a certain momentum of thought, he'd also said, "In San Francisco. There's none." And then by then he'd know he'd made a mistake. "He's living somewhere along Telegraph," he muttered. "I gave you the wrong address." She took a chance. Then the waist address isn't good anymore? She'd pronounced it like it was a word. Waste. His face congealed, a mask of distrust. It's WASTE, baby, lady, he told her. An acronym, not waste. And we'd best not go into it any further. I saw it in a lady's John, she confessed. But Stanley Kotex was no longer about to be sweet-talked. Forget it, he advised, opening a book and proceeded to ignore her. She, in her turn, clearly was not about to forget it. The envelope she'd seen Kotex doodling, what she'd begun to think of as the waste symbol, had come, she bet, from John Nefastus. Or somebody like him. Her suspicions got embellished by, of all people, Mike Fallopian from the Peter Penguin Society. Sure, this Kotex is part of some underground, he told her, then a few days later. An underground of the unbalanced, possibly. But, then, how can you blame him for being maybe a little bitter? Look what's happening to them. In school, they get brainwashed, like all of us, into believing the myth of the American inventor. Morse and his telegraph, Bell and his telephone, Edison and his light bulb, Thomas Swift and his this or that. Only one man per invention. Then they grow up. They found they had to sign over all their rights to a monster like Yoyodyne, got stuck in some project or task force or team, and started being ground into anonymity. Nobody wanted them to invent, only perform their little role in a design manual, already set down for them in some little procedures handbook. What's it like, Oedipus, being all alone in a nightmare like that? Of course they stick together, they keep in touch, they can all tell what they've come together in their mind. They've come on another of their kind. Maybe it only happens once every 5 years, but still, immediately they know. Metzger, who'd come along to the scope that evening, wanted to argue. You're so right-wing, you're left-wing, he protested. You're so right-wing, you're left-wing, he protested. How can you be against a corporation that wants a worker to waive his patent rights? That sounds like the surplus value theory to me, fella, and you sound like a Marxist. As they got drunker, this typical Southern California dialogue degenerated further. Oedipus sat along and gloomy. She decided to come tonight to the scope, not only because of the encounter with Stanley Kotex, but also because of other revelations, because it seemed like a pattern was beginning to emerge, having to do with the mail and how it was delivered. There had been a bronze historical marker on the other side of the lake at Fangoso Lagoons. On this site, it read, in 1853, a dozen Wells Fargo men battled gallantly with a band of masked marauders in mysterious black uniforms. We owe this description to a postwriter, the only witness to the massacre who died shortly after. The only other clue was a cross traced by one of the victims in the dust. To this day, the identities of the slayers remain shrouded in mystery. A cross or the initial T? The same stuttered by Niccolo in the Courier's tragedy. Oedipus pondered this. She called Randolph Drblett from a pay booth to see if he'd known about this Wells Fargo incident, if that was why he'd chosen to dress his bravos all in black. The phone buzzed on into hollowness. She hung up and headed for Zapp's used books. Zapp himself came forward out of a wan cone of 15-watt illumination to help her find the paperback Drblett had mentioned, Jacobean Revenge Plays. It's been very much in demand, Zapp told her. The skull on the cover watched them through a dim light. Did he only mean Drblett? She opened her mouth to ask, but didn't. It was the first of many demurs. Back at Echo Courts, Metzger in L.A. for the day on other business, she turned immediately to the single mention of the word Trastero. Opposite the line she read, in pencil, CF variant 1687 edition. Put there maybe by some student. In a way, it cheered her. Another reading of that line might help light further the dark face of the word. According to a short preface, the text had been taken from a folio edition, undated. Oddly, the preface was unsigned. She checked the copyright page and found that the original hardcover had been a textbook, Plays of Ford, Webster, Turnier, and Warfinger, published by the Lectern Press, Berkeley, California, back in 1957. She poured herself half a tumbler of Jack Daniels. The paranoids had left them a fresh bottle the evening before, and called the L.A. Library. They checked, but didn't have the hardcover. They could look it up in the interlibrary loan for her. Oh, wait, she said, just having an idea. The publisher's up in Berkeley. Maybe I'll try them directly. Thinking also she could visit John Nefastus. She had caught sight of the historical marker only because she'd gone back, deliberately, to Lake Inverarity one day, owing to this, what you might have to call growing obsession with bringing something of herself, even if it was something that just her presence even if that something was just her presence, to the scatter of business interests that had survived in Verarity. She would give them order, she would create constellations. Next day, she drove out of Vesperhaven House, a home for senior citizens that Inverarity had put up around the time Yoyodyne came to San Narciso. In its front recreation room, she found sunlight, coming in, it seemed, through every window. An old man nodding in front of the dim Leon Schlesinger cartoon show at the Tube, and a black fly browsing along the pink dandruffy arroyo of the neat part of the old man's hair. The fat nurse ran in with a can of bug spray and yelled at the fly to take off so she could kill it. The cagey fly stayed where it was. You're bothering Mr. Thoth, she yelled at the little fellow. Mr. Thoth jerked awake, jarring loose the fly, which made a desperate scramble for the door. The nurse pursued, spraying poison. Hello, said Oedipa. I was dreaming, Mr. Thoth told her, about my grandfather, a very old man, at least as old as I am now, 91. I thought, when I was a boy, that he had been 91 all my life. All his life. Now I feel, laughing, as if I have been 91 all my life. Oh, the stories that old men would tell. He rode for the Pony Express back in the gold rush days. His horse was named Adolf. I remember that. Oedipa, sensitized, thinking of the bronze marker, smiled at him as granddaughterly as she knew how, and asked, did he ever have to fight off desperados? That cruel old man, said Mr. Thoth, was an Indian killer. God, the saliva would come out, strung from his lip whenever he told about killing the Indians. Must have loved that part of it. But were you dreaming about him? Oh, that. Perhaps embarrassed. It was all mixed up with a Porky Pig cartoon. He waved at the tube. It comes into your dreams, you know, the filthy machine. Did you ever see one of those the one about Porky Pig and the Anarchist? She had, as a matter of fact, but she said no. The Anarchist is all dressed in black. In the dark, you can only see his eyes. It dates back from the 30s. Porky Pig is a little boy. The children told me that he has a nephew now, Cicero. Do you remember during the war when Porky worked in a defense plant? He and Bugs Bunny, that was a good one too. Dressed all in black, Oedipa prompted him. It was mixed in so with the Indians, he tried to remember. The dream. The Indians who wore black feathers, the Indians who weren't Indians, my grandfather told me. The feathers were white, but those false Indians were supposed to burn bones and stir the bone black with their feathers to get them black. Made them invisible in the night because they came at night. That was how the old man, bless him, knew they weren't Indians. No Indian ever attacked at night. If he got killed, his soul would wander in the dark forever. Heathen. If they weren't Indians, Oedipa asked, what were they? A Spanish name, Mr. Thoth said, frowning. A Mexican name. I don't remember. Did they write it in the ring? He reached down into a knitting bag by his chair and came up with a blue yarn, needles, patterns, and finally a dull signet ring. My grandfather cut this from the finger of one of them he killed. Can you imagine a 91-year-old man so brutal? Oedipa stared. The device on the ring was once again the waist symbol. She looked around, spooked at the sunlight pouring in on all the windows as if she'd been trapped at the center of some intricate crystal, and said, my God. And I feel him certain days of a certain temperature, said Mr. Thoth, and barometric pressure. Did you know that? I feel him close to me. Your grandfather? No, my God. So she went to find Fallopian, who ought to know a lot about the Pony Express and Wells Fargo if he was writing a book about them. He did, but not for their dark adversaries. I've had hints, he told her. Sure, I wrote to Sacramento about that historical marker, and they've been kicking it around in their bureaucratic morass for months. Someday they'll come back with the source book for me to read. It will say, old-timers remember the yarn about whatever happened. Old-timers. Real good documentation, this California crap. Odds are the author will be dead. There's no way to trace it unless you want to follow up on accidental correlation, like you got from the old man. You think that's really a correlation? She thought about how tenuous it was, like a long white hair over a century long. Two very old men, all these fatigued brain cells between herself and the truth. Marauders, nameless, faceless, dressed in black, probably hired by the federal government. Those suppressions were brutal. Couldn't have been a rival carrier. Fallopian shrugged. Oedipa showed him the waist symbol, and he shrugged again. Is in the ladies' room right here next to the scope, Mike. Women, he only said. Who can tell what goes on with them? If she thought to check a couple lines back in the Wharfinger play, Oedipa might have made the next connection by herself. As it was, she got the assist from an old Genghis Cohen, who is the most eminent philatelist in the L.A. area. Metzger, acting on instructions in the will, had retained this amiable, slightly adenoidal expert for a percent of his valuation to inventory and appraise Inverarity's stamp collection. One rainy morning, with mist rising off the pool, Metzger ran away again. Ran away. The paranoids off somewhere in a recording session. Oedipa got rung up by Genghis Cohen, who, even over the phone, she could tell was disturbed. "There are some irregularities, Miss Maz," he said. "Could you come over?" She was somehow sure, driving in the black freeway, that the irregularities would tie in with the word Trastero. Metzger had taken the stamp collections to Cohen from a safe deposit storage a week ago in Oedipa's Impala, and then she hadn't been interested enough to look inside them. But now it came to her, as if the rain whispered it, and that what Fallopian had not known about the private carriers, Cohen might. When he opened the door of his apartment office, she saw him framed in a long succession of train of doorways, room after room, receding in the general direction of Santa Monica, all soaked to rainlight. Genghis Cohen had a touch of summer flu. His fly was half open, and he was wearing a Barry Goldwater sweatshirt also. Oedipa felt at once motherly. In a room, perhaps a third of the way along the suite, he sat her in a rocking chair and brought real homemade dandelion wine in small neat glasses. "I picked the dandelions in a cemetery 2 years ago. Now the cemetery's gone. They took it out for the East San Narciso Freeway." She could, at this stage of things, recognize signals like that, as the epileptic is said to, in odor, color, pure, piercing grace note announcing his seizure. Afterward, it was only the signal, really, dross, the secular announcement, and never what it is revealed during the attack that he remembers. Oedipa wondered whether, at the end of this, if it were supposed to end, she too might not be left with only compiled memories of clues, announcements, intimations, but never the central truth itself, which must somehow each time be too bright for her memory to hold, which must always blaze out, destroying its own message irreversibly, leaving an overexposed blank when the ordinary world came back. In the space of a sip of dandelion wine, it came to her she would never know how many times such a seizure may already have visited, or how to grasp it should it visit again. Perhaps in this last second, but there's no way to tell. She glanced down the corridor of Cohen's room in the rain and saw, for the very first time, how far it might be possible to get lost in this thing. "I've taken the liberty," Genghis Cohen was saying, "of getting in touch with the expert committee. I haven't yet forwarded them stamps in question, pending your own authorization, of course, Mr. Metzger's. However, all fees, I'm sure, can be charged to the estate." "I'm not sure I understand," Oedipa said. "Allow me." He rolled over to the small table and, from a plastic folder lifted with tweezers, delicately, a U.S. commemorative stamp, the Pony Express issue of 1940, 3-cent henna brown, canceled. "Look," he said, switching in a small, intense lamp, handing her an oblong magnifying glass. "It's the wrong side," she said, as she swabbed the stamp gently with benzene and placed it on the black tray. The watermark. Oedipa peered. There was again her waist symbol, showing up black, a little right of the center. "What is this?" she asked, wondering how much time had gone by. "I'm not sure," Cohen said. "That's why I've referred it, and the others, to the committee. Some friends have been around to see them too, but they're all just being cautious. But see what you think from this." In the same plastic folder, he now tweezed what looked like an old German stamp along with the figures 1/4 in the center, the word Freemark on the top, and along the right-hand margin the legend Thurn and Taxis. They were, she remembered from the Wharfinger play, some kind of private couriers, right? For about 1300, until Bismarck bought them out in the 1867. Miss Maz, they were the European mail service. This is one of their very few adhesive stamps, but look in the corners. Decorating each corner of the stamp, Oedipa saw a horn with a single loop on it, almost like the waist symbol. A post horn, Cohen said. The Thurn and Taxis symbol. It was their coat of arms. "And tacit lies the gold once-knotted horn," Oedipa remembered. "Sure. Then the watermark you found," she said, "is nearly the same thing, except the extra little dewjigger sort of coming out of the bell." "It sounds ridiculous," Cohen said, "but my guess is it's a mute." She nodded. The black costumes, the silence, the secrecy. Whoever they were, their aim was to mute the Tharnantax's post-horn. Normally this issue and the others are unwatermarked, Cohen said, and in view of other details, the hatching, number of perforations, way the paper is aged, it's obviously a counterfeit, not just an error. Then it isn't worth anything. Cohen smiled, blew his nose. You'd be amazed how much you can sell an honest forgery for. Some collectors specialize in them. The question is, who did these? They're atrocious. He flipped the stamp over and with the tip of the tweezers showed her. The picture had a Pony Express rider galloping out from a western fort. From shrubbery over on the right-hand side, and possibly in the direction the rider would be heading, protruded a single painstakingly engraved black feather. Why put in a deliberate mistake? He asked, ignoring, if he saw it, the look of her face. I've come up so far with 8 in all. Each one has an error like this, laboriously worked into the design, like a taunt. There's even a transposition, U.S. pot sage, of all things. How recent, blurted Oedipa, louder than she needed to be. Is anything wrong, Miss Maz? She told him about the letter from Mucho with the cancellation telling her report all obscene mail to her pots master. Odd, Cohen agreed. The transposition, consulting a notebook, is only on the Lincoln 4-cent, regular issue, 1954. The other forgeries run back to 1893. That's 70 years. He'd have to be pretty old. If it's the same one, said Cohen, and what if it were as old as Tharnantaxis? Amediotasis, banished from Milan, organized the first couriers of the Bergamo region around 1290. They sat in silence, listening to the rain gnaw languidly at the windows and skylights, confronted all at once by the marvelous possibility. Has it ever happened before, she had to ask? In 800-year tradition of postal fraud, not to my knowledge. Oedipa told him all about the truth of Mr. Thoth's signet ring, and the symbol she'd caught Stanley Kotex doodling, and the muted horn drawn in the ladies' room at the scope. Whatever it is, he hardly needed to say, they're apparently still quite active. Do we tell the government or what? I'm not sure they know more than we do. He sounded nervous, or suddenly in retreat. No, I wouldn't. It's not our business, is it? She asked him about the initials WASTE, but it was somehow too late. She'd lost him. He said no, but so abruptly out of phase now with her own thoughts that he could even have been lying. He poured her more dandelion wine. It's clearer now, he said, rather formal. A few months ago it got quite cloudy, you see. In spring, when the dandelions begin to bloom, again, the wine goes through a fermentation, as if they remembered. No, thought Oedipa, sad. As if their home cemetery in some way still did exist, in a land where you could somehow walk and not need the East San Narciso freeway, and bones could still rest in peace, nourishing ghosts of dandelions, no one to plow them up, as if the dead really do persist, even in a bottle of wine. End of chapter 4.